Welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. Draught Bass. It's an iconic beer which holds a very special place in many a real ale drinker's heart. Although once a beer with nationwide distribution, for a few decades now it has been quite hard to find outside of its home turf of the Midlands. But is it about to make a big comeback? Even here in London. I've come to the Express Tavern here in Cubridge, which is a pub that, as you can see on the exterior there, has been serving Draught Bass for some time. It even has a neon sign. Let's start by talking a little bit about the history of this famous brewer and its famous beer. Bass Brewery was founded in 1777, nearly 250 years ago, and they launched their famous pale ale in 1823. It was largely intended for the export market, but from the outset it was also popular here at home. It was shipped to all corners of the British Empire, most famously India, but one of the earliest newspaper mentions I could find for it was from Australia in 1830. We are led to believe that it's these requirements for long-distance travel which were at the heart of the creation of the India Pale Ale style. A heavier use of hops, which were believed to act as a preservative, and also a more thorough fermentation in the brewery to reduce the amount of residual sugars in the beer. And of course we can't talk about Bass Pale Ale without mentioning that famous red triangle, registered as the first ever trademark in 1875, and the fact that a few years later, in 1882, it was immortalised in Manet's painting The Bar at the Folies Bergère. I love how the two bottles, I think, on display here of Bass Pale Ale stand proudly in amongst these bottles of champagne. I had planned to record more of this video at the Express Tavern, but things really weren't going my way on this occasion. I was struggling to find a quiet spot to film around the pub, then I was having audio issues, and then when I went to get a second pint of Bass, they had changed the barrel and it was going to need potentially hours to settle. It's a shame, as this pub has quite a lot going for it. It's on camera's list of historic pub interiors with a surprisingly high 3-star rating. I think they get particularly excited about it because it may have some surviving mid-Victorian interior features. Particularly they draw attention to this clock above what is now a corner snug but was formerly a publican's parlour. Quite possibly this dates to 1870. There are a lot of surviving late Victorian features in London pubs, but not many quite this old. The bar counter and bar back are apparently original. Another striking feature is this marble fireplace, and there's a pub dog as well. As if all of that isn't enough, there's an impressive lineup of hand pumps. I counted 10. Of course, inevitably some of those are given over to grapefruit flavoured beers, but over to the right hand side there are two very appealing options for me: Harvey's Sussex Best and the whole point of this video, Draught Bass. So for the next bit of the video, I've come to another pub that hopefully, fingers crossed, also has Draught Bass as a permanent fixture on the bar, the Hand and Shears near Smithfield Market. Cheers from the Hand and Shears. Draught Bass, this stuff here, is somehow descended from that 200-year-old beer, Bass Pale Ale. Clearly a lot has happened in the interim, but it was not a product sold solely in bottles, as is the impression you might get from that Manet painting in the 19th century. Here's an advert for it sold both on draft and in bottles at a hotel in 1873 in Southampton, and you may also find one of the other beers on offer there familiar today. Within that decade, by 1877, Bass became the single biggest brewer in the world. The current ownership and production of Draught Bass is a bit of a complicated situation, so here's a new and quite possibly ill-advised segment called Mergers and Acquisitions Story Time with Tweedy. Once upon a time, there was a company called Bass, whose business was almost solely focused on brewing beer. At the start of the 20th century, when it was common for other large brewers to also own and operate pubs, Bass weren't initially very interested in that sort of thing, and instead relied on the reputation of their beer to drive sales in outlets they didn't own themselves. However, during the course of the 20th century, Bass was involved in various mergers and acquisitions of other brewers, including perhaps most notably Mitchells and Butlers in the early 1960s, then Charringtons later in that decade. This way, Bass did eventually eventually acquire a pub portfolio of its own. The beer orders came along in 1989. This was legislation designed to break up the stranglehold the breweries had on pubs. By this time, Bass had a portfolio of over 7,000 pubs, so they were firmly in the crosshairs of the Monopolies and Mergers Commission. They were forced to split the company up into two divisions, one for hospitality and one for brewing. In the year 2000, Bass as a company name ceased to exist. The hospitality side of the business was spun off into a company called Six Continents, which then later again subdivided into a pub company we now know as Mitchells and Butlers, and a hotel company called Intercontinental. The same year, the brewing side of the business was sold to a Belgian brewing company called Interbrew, the makers of Stella Artois, and that included the rights to the Bass brand. In 2004, Interbrew then merged with Brazilian brewer Ambev, and together they formed a company called InBev. Then in 2008, InBev merged with American brewer Anheuser-Busch to create the global behemoth we know today as AB InBev, the world's largest brewer. As if all of that were not already complicated enough, the new owners of the Bass brand had decided they weren't going to make Draught Bass themselves, and instead licensed it out to Marston's, which on the plus side meant brewing remained in the ancestral home of Bass, Burton-on-Trent. This would almost be a happy ending were it not for the fact that Marston's too fell foul of what seems to be the inevitable fate of all large British brewers. They sell off their brewing operations to focus on running their pub estate. This happened in 2020 and initially took the form of a joint venture with Carlsberg's UK operations to form a company called Carlsberg Marston's Brewing Company. However, in 2024, Carlsberg bought Marston out entirely, and as of 2025, the corporate entity which now owns Marston's former brewing operations is called Carlsberg Britvic. They still brew Draught Bass for AB InBev at the Marston Brewery site in Burton-on-Trent. Despite all these changes, Draught Bass has a legion of very loyal fans, and most of the writing I see on the modern incarnation of Draught Bass, despite its many layers of multinational ownership, seem to be generally quite positive. A beer is, after all, ultimately a recipe and should in theory be recreatable given the right ingredients, the right equipment and the right know-how, and there has been much speculation over the years about how exactly Draught Bass is brewed. There is a great article on the Boak Bailey blog about this, and I'll put a link to that in the description. Roger Protz was of the opinion a couple of decades ago that the chief hops used were Challenger and Northdown, but other sources suggest a much longer list of hops, including our old friends Golding and Fuggles, the Challenger as aforementioned, and also some slightly more unusual English hops like Admiral and Progress. There's also talk of a unique yeast strain, or in fact two distinct yeast strains, as an essential part of the recipe for making Draught Bass. Most tasting notes for Draught Bass mention either a caramel or toffee quality, both on the nose and on the palate. Certainly not overly sweet, but that's definitely there. And occasionally talk of a kind of nuttiness to it as well. Yeah, and I think I get that, a slight hint of dry roasted nuts. It's a very pubby sort of aroma. The hopping is generally described as being relatively subtle, so there's clearly been a lot of development since those early days when it was made as an India Pale Ale, quite heavily hopped, for export to other parts of the British Empire. Coming back to that legion of loyal fans, there is a great article in the Pellicle magazine by beer writer Phil Mellows. I'll put a link to that in the description as well. He talks about his history with Draught Bass and also slightly bemoans the lack of interest from AB InBev to market it. I think that's possibly on the brink of change, and we'll come back to that in a moment. While we've been waiting for some corporate push for Draught Bass, that legion of fans has been trying to promote the beer themselves. There is a National Bass Day which falls in April, and there is a Facebook group to organise that. There's also an impressive effort to create a directory of every pub in the UK which serves Draught Bass, either as a permanent or as a guest beer. This was originally created by Ian Thurman, and it's now maintained by Quinton Taylor, with contributions from a huge number of Bass devotees. I'll put a link to that as well in the description. I was particularly delighted to see there are 4 pubs listed in Greater London which have Bass as a permanent fixture on the bar. Here where I am now, the Hand and Shears in Smithfield, the Express Tavern in Cubridge or Brentford, where I was earlier in the video, the Winchester in Highgate, and one that I'm not familiar with, the Flower Pot in Walthamstow. We should pause there briefly to talk about the Hand and Shears where I am now, because it is a spectacular pub. I've covered it before in a video on Smithfield pubs. It's an independent pub and I think very well regarded for its beer. Currently the two hand pumps there are Timothy Taylor's Landlord and Draught Bass. This is in absolutely spectacular condition. It's very, very good. And it's on camera's list of historic pub interiors as well. Beautiful interior with an island bar, quite well preserved from the late Victorian period. And this is also, we are led to believe, the place where the tradition of cutting ribbons to open everything from shopping centres to airports started, because that was a tradition for the opening of the cloth fair, which was held annually next door to Smithfield Market. Of course, there will be those out there who will dismiss the modern incarnation of Draught Bass because they'd rather support small independent breweries, and I do have some sympathy with that point of view. However, if the issue is solely that it is today brewed by the world's largest brewer, AB InBev, then it's worth pointing out that 150 years ago that was also the case. It was brewed by the world's largest brewer of the day at that time. They just happened to be called Bass. Despite until now, AB InBev's apparent lack of interest in marketing this iconic brand, there are definitely murmurs in the industry that that may be about to change. I've seen reports that some of their sales reps are out pushing the brand to try and get it on the bar lineup of more pubs around the country. We've seen other traditional English beers like Timothy Taylor's Landlord and Harvey's Sussex Best go from being a very rare find here in London to now being happily quite commonplace. And it's also been encouraging to see the revival of the Allsops brand, which has somewhat a shared history with Bass. That was, I think, the claimant to the very first India Pale Ale, pipping Bass to the post by just a year or two. All of that, coupled with the legion of loyal Bass fans who've been there all along, suggests to me that the stage is set for a big Draught Bass comeback. So today, here in London at least, we have just 4 pubs which have Draught Bass as a permanent fixture on the bar. But I think a year from now we could be seeing dozens. Cheers.